Thank you very much, and could I just thank you all for braving a wintry Melbourne evening to be here to celebrate the opening of this Deakin lecture series. I think we're in for an extremely interesting week, and I'd like to open that week with a question that might strike some of you as being esoteric, but I think is really essential to the human enterprise. And I'd like to look at that fundamental philosophical question, I guess, and then move on to investigate its implications for current Australian policy, for politics, for where we are at this moment. When I look at the environmental space and look at people around the world who are publishing in that space, what I see really is an air of pretty profound pessimism. You don't have to read much further than James Lovelock's recent book, The Eclipse of Gaia, or Clive Hamilton's book, Requiem for a Species. The title says it all. Or Cormac McCarthy's The Road, even, in fiction, to see that there's a prevailing view in our society that we are in the last days of greatness and that a collapse is soon to follow. It suggests, all of those views, that humanity is destined to destroy itself in an orgy of overconsumption aided by destructive technology and an ineffective political response. I don't believe that's a very useful view to hold, and I don't think it's even necessarily a true view. The alternative is that we'll reach an accommodation with our planet. And if that is true, it's interesting to speculate what that accommodation might look like and what evidence there is for that particular view. All too often, as we're trying to conceptualise where we stand in terms of change, our view is blurred. We're just too close to the subject. And it's very difficult for us in our day-to-day struggle with these big issues to see if we are in fact in a spiral towards chaos or in the midst of a grand revolution that will change the basis of our relationship with planet Earth. You just get too close to be able to tell what we see as change, but we can't see the broad directionality. In order to see that broad directionality, you have to take a long-term view, a long-term and broad view. It's a bit like looking at a graph of climate change. If we try to understand climate change through the last week's weather reports, we won't get anywhere. You need to take a century-long view to see the rise in temperature and the big picture. So what I'd like to do is take that broad view. And in order to do it, I really want to go back to the beginnings of our understanding of our true origins, back to Charles Darwin and his big new idea that he finally published in 1858. That view, that evolutionary view, after all, described the process that made us, quite literally, that made us what we are, and it made our world. Darwin first published an outline of his theory of evolution in July 1858, and I think that his first stab at explaining what he discovered has never been bettered. He wrote, "Can it be doubted, from the struggle each individual has to obtain subsistence, that any minute variation in structure, habits or instincts, adapting that individual better to the new conditions, would tell upon its vigour and health? In the struggle, it would have a better chance of surviving than those of offsprings which inherited the variation, be it ever so slight, would also have a better chance. Yearly more are bred than can survive. The smallest grain in the balance in the long run must tell on which death shall fall and which shall survive. Let this work of selection on the one hand and death on the other go on for 1,000 generations, and who'll pretend to affirm that it would produce no effect?" So what he's laying out there is just a very basic thing. More are born than will survive. Those best fitted to the circumstances will survive, and in the end, they'll prevail. There's no inherent morality in that view, but Darwin was deeply troubled by it. For 20 years he sat on his theory and wouldn't reveal it to the world. I recently went to Darwin's house last year. It's now a shrine to one of the greatest scientists that's ever lived. And I was particularly keen to go out onto what's called the Sandwalk, which is in a bit of a woodland just away from the house. I was surprised by it. It's a sort of a racetrack, really, around a bit of woodland. Darwin had planned it and built it. And virtually every day of his life he walked around the sandwalk. People think perhaps he was perfecting his theories out there as he was walking around in the bush. Other people think maybe he was crafting those brilliant sentences that brought his theory to public notice. I don't believe there's evidence that that was the case. I think when you look at the writings of Darwin and his children, what you see is that he was figuratively fingering his worry beads as he walked around the sandwalk for hours on end. He actually was so worried about his idea that he wrote to one of his colleagues about the theory of evolution. It's like confessing a murder. And I think the reason that he was so concerned about his ideas was he understood at some level the possible impacts they would have on his society. After all, the very day that his great idea was published, Darwin couldn't present it. His son, named Charles, had died, aged 18 months old. Natural selection, as Darwin was describing it that day to the world, had taken his son from him. And in that theory was the seeds of taking comfort from those who were so bereaved, because the theory struck at the theology of the day. It struck at people's belief, at their religious belief, at the belief in an afterlife and so forth. So not just were his ideas telling us that we are the creation of a cruel, an unspeakably cruel process, but that the comforts that we've built to console ourselves would also be destroyed as the theory became better known. When Darwin finally published his great book on evolution the next year, he did it under the title On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. The book was an instant success. It really cemented Darwin as the great evolutionist. But that use of the term favoured races in the title of the book should give us pause for thought. What Darwin meant, I think, by favoured races was that worms that were better burrowers were a favoured race over worms that weren't so good at burrowing. But in 19th century England, I think favoured races meant just one thing. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, it meant British upper-class gentlemen. They were the favoured race who had colonised the world, who had forged in their factories this great industrial revolution that was transforming mankind. They were transcendent. Of course, other Englishmen took those ideas and fitted them to their own ends. The philosopher and social scientist Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest. He was really taking Darwin's views and applying them in a social context in a way that facilitated those who believed that they were superior, and that this cruel process inevitably consigned those who were not so fit to a nasty end. Not much has changed since Victorian England in terms of our belief about the process that made us. Richard Dawkins is in many ways the modern Charles Darwin. His book on the selfish gene is an extraordinary scientific breakthrough, but it bears the same fragility and same implications for our society that Darwin's work did. He says in that book, I think nature read in tooth and claw sums up our modern understanding of natural selection admirably. And he goes on to talk about the relationship between mother and child. He says, the sight of a child smiling or the sound of a kitten purring is rewarding to a mother, in the same sense as food in the stomach is rewarding to a rat in a maze. But once it becomes true that a sweet smile or a purr are rewarding, the child is in a position to use the smile or the purr in order to manipulate the parent and gain more than its fair share of parental investment. And with those sort of sentiments, we reduce the most precious thing in life, the bond between a mother and a child, the love between us, to competition, to a mechanistic form of competition. It is a fundamental debasing, I believe, of the human spirit and of our society to allow those sort of views to define our sense of the world we live in. The sense that the world results from intense competition still permeates our social fabric. It's the foundation stone, for example, of neoclassical economics and the economic systems that still rule our markets and still have deep impacts on our lives. The idea that markets must be free of all social and government constraint and that corporations exist solely to make a profit result ultimately from that view of life, that in fact it is red in tooth and claw. But is that view at all correct? Are we so selfish that competition is what drives us? And at the end of the day, if you believe in survival of the fittest, you believe that no one will survive because we can't stand alone. In a game where survival of the fittest rules, you create a death spiral. And recently scientists have recognised this. Peter Ward wrote a book called The Medea Hypothesis last year that takes that as its very theme, that in fact in that Darwinian worldview, none survive, that life is ultimately toxic to life itself. I just don't think that any of those views can be right. And as evidence, I give you my own body and your own bodies. We are single entities composed of billions of collaborating cells. And each one of those collaborating cells has two fundamental parts, which a billion years or more ago were quite separate organisms that came to live together. So the mitochondria, the power packs in our cells, were originally free-living bacteria. They came to live in our cells, and now not a millisecond can go by where the mitochondria in our cells can exist separately. Such a perfect union has been formed, we think of them as one entity, one being, and they are us. Those two things that came together in the distant past are part of a grand collaboration that creates us. And of course, if survival of the fittest absolutely ruled, would we live in a society like this where it looks like 1,500 people would come together to discuss our common future? I don't think so. The sort of collaborations, interdependencies and great synergies that have occurred in the last 10,000 years in human society have a very different root. And that root was first, I guess I shouldn't say it was, that beginning, that origin was there from the very start in evolutionary theory. Darwin wasn't alone in positing the idea that we are evolved organisms. Alfred Russel Wallace is the co-founder of the theory of evolution. He published his ideas with Darwin in 1858, and Wallace had a very, very different view of what life is than Darwin did. Having said that, Wallace's view of evolutionary theory was identical. He was to Darwin's. He was an extraordinary man, a working-class collector of natural history specimens. He was a great genius whose inspirations came to him, I believe, in flashes of insight, very different from Darwin, who was the ultimate reductionist scientist who tried to understand the world from looking at ever smaller parts of it. When Wallace came across his evolutionary insight on the island of Ternate in what is now Indonesia, he was in the middle of a malarial fever and had this vision of how the world may have been created. He immediately wrote it down, sent his letter off to Darwin, and Darwin, who'd been sitting on his idea for 20 years, was utterly devastated, because here, a working-class man, halfway around the world, had written down a theory identical in every respect to Darwin's. Darwin sent the letter off to a good friend, but with a complaint saying, my life's work now has been rendered useless, this man has preempted me. His friends got together, suggested that the idea be co-published, and that's how we ended up with the publication of the theory of evolution in 1858. Wallace lived to be a grand old man, lived to be 90 years old, and towards the end of his life, he increasingly turned to the questions that evolutionary theory, as Darwin understood it, simply couldn't answer. When he was 80 years old in 1903, he wrote an extraordinary book, now long forgotten, called Man and the Universe. It really is the foundation text of the science of astrobiology. It's the beginning of Gaia theory, and it lays out very clearly a new moral philosophy of evolution. In that book, Wallace takes us as evolved entities and takes the broadest view possible of what we are and what we may potentially achieve. He argues at the end of that book that it is human destiny, really, for the human spirit to be perfected in the vastness of the universe, as he puts it. He sees us as a fundamental force. He argues that intelligence has only ever evolved once in the whole universe, that it's right here on this earth, and that in his time, 1900, he could see the formation of a single human culture whose destiny lay billions of light years from this planet. His work, for all its grandness, was forgotten after 2 world wars and all of the bitterness they brought, and it took until the 1970s for another individual to build on those fundamental insights. James Lovelock followed in Wallace's tradition. His Gaia theory showed in a much more explicit way, because the science had moved on, how everything on Earth is linked and interdependent with everything else. His book argues that everything on Earth, in fact, is akin to one great organism, that our Earth acts in a way similar to a single great organism. Such things, of course, don't result entirely from competition. So which of the 2 great strands is the right one? Are we destined to destroy ourselves? Will survival of the fittest see life destroy all life? Or does competition and cooperation reign here on Earth? The way I view it is this, that competition is evolution's motive force. It's what drives the evolutionary process, that competition that Darwin first outlined. But that the legacy of that process is cooperation, and legacies can endure long after initial processes have either changed or ceased. Not that evolution ceased, but that it may have changed. In a world that has been shaped by those forces, we have come to a point, I believe, where what we believe as human beings is the single most important thing in the world. And if you doubt that, just consider for a moment that 2 centuries ago, an engineer called James Watt had a bright idea about how coal, steam and movement could be used to create a new machine. And as a result of that idea, today the composition of our very atmosphere has changed. That insight about using fossil fuels to power things is at the heart of the climate crisis, changed the nature of our atmosphere. If we believe truly that we live in a dog-eat-dog world, that's what we'll create. And I guess you could justify that by thinking that through most of human history we've been selfish, destructive beings, and our history is replete with examples that would make you despair about the wisdom of humanity and its future. But that's the short view. I began this lecture by trying to talk about the long view. And the long view from me is the great arc of human history that begins 10,000 years ago, when the first human beings came to settle in a village. At that time, we all lived as clans or families in eternal conflict with each other. And over time, we've built larger and larger political units, at every step of the way sacrificing something, giving away some autonomy. And I just say this because, Aboriginal people or people who lived before the settlement of villages were consummately good at everything. They had to make their own tools, make their own huts. They had to be their own law and order. They had to be their children's teachers. They had to be their own defence. Every day was a challenge. As we've built larger and larger political units, we've sacrificed some of that autonomy. Until today, we've given birth to a civilization at the heart of which lies these enormous cities. And that process has really produced a species where our interdependence is now so great that none of us can live outside the great hive. Were we cast out of our civilization today, the great majority of us would perish within weeks. We'd be like rabbits, white rabbits, on a plain. I might just take a moment to think about what we are today in that sense. Some studies have been done of changing human brain sizes over time. So if you go back 10,000 years in Europe and look at the size of the human brain relative to the body of people at the time and compare it with today, you find that human brains have shrunk by 10% or a little bit more. Now, there's a tiny difference in the ratio between men and women in this regard, and I'm not going to go into which one shrunk more. It's only going to cause a vast distraction. But these changes are very real, and they come about perhaps because in times past, the causes of mortality were all things that a really smart person could help avoid, and so there was strong selection for braininess. Over the last 10,000 years, the causes of mortality are hardly avoidable. No one understood about germs in time past. So there has been a shift in the way our body allocates energy, and our brains perhaps are getting less than they have in the past. And until we understood basic hygiene and nutrition, we were weaklings. Up to the 19th century, we were short little people. I mean, the Europeans that came ashore here to settle Melbourne were all the products of the stunting processes of European industrial cities. Horrendous air pollution, poor diets, very poor health conditions. And who did they meet here? The Jagga brothers, Aboriginal people, 6'2" and 6'4" tall, magnificent specimens, fully capable in every sense of the word of controlling their destiny. And yet who triumphed? It was those poxed and starved weaklings that triumphed, our ancestors, because of the power that we have forged in common at the expense of us as individuals. That sense of us as a group, of us as a global civilization, is the most precious thing in the world now. None of us can live outside it. Evolution has changed us. We have changed ourselves. The only possible future we have is in common at some level. When I look at that great sweep of history, that 10,000 years of history, and consider our future, it seems to me that we've run most of the marathon already. We can see the finishing line ahead of us, just a few steps ahead of us, and the finishing line will consist of the creation of a global human civilization. We're on the very brink of that now. The great question we have is whether we have it in us to run those extra few steps. But there's a roadblock in our way, and that is climate change. Unless we address the issue of climate change this decade, it's likely that we will lose the opportunity to forge that global civilization, because a conflict over diminishing resources, an incompetent political system may well have such an impact on us that we will be unable to proceed. Among the more dismaying things that's happened in the recent past is the failure, or partial failure I should say, of COP15, the meeting in Copenhagen last year, when the nations of the world got together to try to address the climate problem. But even there, we shouldn't lose sight of the progress that's been made as a result of the Copenhagen process. Places like China, South Africa, Brazil, the big developing economies, and India, all own that process now. And some of them are doing extraordinary things. The Chinese government, for example, has committed to a 40 to 45% decrease in emissions intensity by 2020. If they achieve that, and there is every sign that they will, governments like the Chinese government don't just put up targets to be made fools of by failing, they will have opened up the possibility that we can stabilise emissions of greenhouse gases at a level that will see us avoiding dangerous climate change. But in order for that to happen, countries like Australia, the developed world, has to play its part too. And we, unfortunately, us wooden spooners, if you want us, the Americans, the Canadians, are not playing our role. In fact, Australia now is leading the charge away from a solution. By delaying the CPRS for 3 years, we've made it so much more difficult for ourselves. We've only got 10 years to make the cuts that we've pledged, even though they're insufficient. But even to make those cuts, we've only got 10 years. If you waste a third of that time, how in heaven's name are we ever going to get to where we need to get to? There's problems at every level of government, not just the federal level. Here in Victoria, we've seen deals between Alcoa and Loy Yang Power to supply effectively energy from a polluting source out till 2036. It's really, when I look at the Victorian government and energy policy, I don't see the deep commitment to a change that is absolutely necessary. Here in this state, you have the most polluting energy source pretty much on the planet. Things have to change, and yet we are not getting the government leadership that's required. And could I just say, even in the little things, we're not seeing the leadership that's required. This state still logs its old-growth forest. They happen to be the most carbon-dense old-growth forests on the planet. You as taxpayers are logging them effectively at an economic loss. It's hard to see how that makes any sense, and unless a government can actually step up to the mark and say, no, at least in this we're going to change, what hope have we that we will see the fundamental shift that's required in terms of this state's energy infrastructure? Somehow we need to re-empower and re-energise our governments to make sure that these challenges are actually met. As I look around the world, I see that we're not alone in facing these problems. Sure, there's places like China and South Korea that are doing it far better than us. But when you look at the Western democracies, you can see a sort of a sickness in them that's been there ever since Denmark, ever since COP15, perhaps longer. In the UK, we've seen the Liberal Democrats come into coalition government. In the US, we've seen the rise of the Tea Party. Here in Australia, we've seen the Greens take up their first ministerial positions in a state government or in any government in Australia. The rise of third-party politics tells us that there is a fundamental failing in the conventional parties. It's not just in Australia, this is a global phenomenon. If we look at our own federal government, we can see where some of the ills lie. I've written recently that our Prime Minister's shelving of the CPRS was, in the true sense of the word, a funk, a failure to live up to one's obligations. And I still don't understand why that decision was taken for a Prime Minister who came to power on two great issues, work choices and addressing the climate challenge, who said that this was the most important issue facing us, who actually still had the power, still has the power at this moment to call a double dissolution election and deliver his policy. For someone to back away from that policy when they're in that position is a profound moral failure, in my view, and a very disappointing one. When I look at the political landscape now, I must say I feel that we are at a moment of decision. The whole issue of this super profits tax has brought into clear view something that's always been there in Australian politics, but which we've been able to ignore before, and that is the power of large corporations to dictate government budgets. We are now in a position where large corporations may well be able to dictate how the government is going to spend money on you, the taxpayer of Australia, what will be funded and what won't. That is an intolerably frightening, devastating, dare I say, position to be in for corporations to have that power. I guess if I believed that Clive Palmer was a true patriot who would always act in the national interest, I might have a different view. But since he decided to take, or said he would take his game away offshore and stuff Australia, then I'm not sure that I have that faith. Big companies like Xstrata, sure, they're important in the Australian economy, but can we really expect them to act in the national interest? You've only got to look at Mount Isa, where that company is struggling with lead poisoning in children, with elevated lead levels in blood in children, to understand that companies like that don't always act in the national interest. This is a moment to get involved in politics, because what is at stake now is, in my view, far greater than has been at stake before. We need to become involved if we hope to rescue our democracies, and I think that the Deakin Lecture Series is a great platform to start re-energising ourselves and to start becoming involved once again. In the next few weeks, you'll hear from practitioners who have actually done something. I wanted to put this lecture series together around people who've achieved something, not theoreticians who have a great idea but don't know how to implement it. Some of them might not be names that are as well known as some of the theoreticians, but they are extremely carefully chosen, and I hope that they will act as a guide to you and I and our politicians and others as to how we might be able to do things a little bit better in future. Having said that now, I have only to say that it's over to you, both for questions and action. Thank you.